Hey guys, I'm Cameron. I'm a marriage therapist and the founder of the Hitched app, the first ever evidence-based personalized blueprint for a lifelong marriage. So this is the second part of my biggest insights as a marriage therapist. So if you go to the link in the description of this video, you can find the link to that first video if you want to check it out. As a reminder, the 3 insights that I covered in the last video were: number 1, most conflict happens because you two don't know each other as well as you think you do. Number 2, it matters more that your spouse feels understood than that you are understood. And number 3, the 50-50 myth makes spouses miserable. So today we're going to cover the rest of my insights, starting with number 4, radical personal responsibility is the fastest way to reduce conflict. Number 5, if you want peace in your marriage, hold yourself to a higher standard than your spouse does. Number 6, most battles aren't worth having. Number 7, if you start to feel heated in a fight, the only good choice is to walk away. And number 8, your definition of marriage will set you up for success or failure. So before jumping into these last 5 insights, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. And if you find this information useful, please share this video with a friend or a family member who you think could get something out of it, because that really lets me know that this is the sort of content you guys want to see. Okay, number 4. Radical personal responsibility is the fastest way to reduce conflict. Taking radical personal responsibility in your relationship essentially means that you look at the situation that you and your spouse are in, and you ask yourself the question of what are all the things that you did wrong that led you to where you and your spouse are today. In other words, you take on as much responsibility as you reasonably can, up to the point where one of 2 things happens. Either you take on too much responsibility and start to develop shame. So shame is different from guilt. Guilt is a pro-social behavior, meaning that it actually helps us do good for other people and society because it motivates us to recognize when we do something wrong and then try to fix it or make up for it. Shame, on the other hand, tells you that you are wrong. So if guilt tells you you did something wrong, shame says you are inherently wrong and there's nothing you can do about it. And that's just going to zap your motivation and make it feel like it is an insurmountable obstacle to improve yourself and your relationship. So you want to accept as much responsibility as you can for the situation you're in your marriage, up to the point of developing shame, because you don't want that. But you also don't want to rob your spouse of the opportunity to accept some responsibility as well, because we can only really start to improve a situation if we're willing to admit when we went wrong, if we're willing to take on some of the responsibility and start making a change. The idea of taking on extra personal responsibility from what we would normally do is radical because it does go against our natural tendency, which is to try to place the blame on other people. That can be for a number of reasons. A lot of the times it's really just to protect our own ego or our own sense of self, because when we have to admit that we went wrong, that means that there is something about us that needs to improve. And that can be really painful. So being able to embrace a little bit of discomfort or even a lot of discomfort in recognizing how you're contributing to the issues in your relationship is going to be a first and major step towards actually making the marriage work. Number 5, if you want peace in your marriage, hold yourself to a higher standard than your spouse does. So this is pretty straightforward. This one is going to reduce a lot of conflict in your relationship for a couple of reasons. Number 1, if your standard for yourself is higher than your spouse's, that means that you're going to be going, in their eyes, above and beyond what is expected of you. And then they're going to have very little room to complain about your behavior. For example, if your spouse asks you to take the garbage out by 7 p.m., but you take it out by 6:30, no complaints there. Or if your spouse asks you to make it on time for dinner, but you show up a little early, again, there's going to be no possible complaints there. And you're probably even going to make your spouse happy that you're really taking their requests seriously. So no more complaints from the love of your life is great, but the even bigger deal with having a higher standard for yourself than your spouse does is that it's going to start to unravel some of that resentment that you might have for your spouse placing expectations on you. So everyone works this way. We are much more motivated by what comes from inside of us, our own goals, our own standards or expectations, than we are on expectations that are placed on us by another person or a circumstance or anything external to ourselves. And so if you are actually living up to your own standards and they just so happen to be higher than what your spouse wants from you, that feeling that you're being controlled or even manipulated, or any risk of you resenting your spouse for trying to get you to live a certain way, that's immediately going to start to dissipate, because these are now your expectations. These are now your goals for yourself. And that's going to be a lot more motivational and give you a lot more of a sense of freedom and power and autonomy. Some pushback I often get from clients on this point is that we have the question, why can't our spouse just love us for who we are? Why can't I just be who I am? Why do I have to change? Why do I have to improve or grow for my spouse to love me? And this question, although it's really common, I think it really misses the point of what love is. So love is wanting what's best for someone else and actually doing what you think is in the best interest of another person. And so if your spouse loves you, she's going to have high standards for you because she knows that what is best for you is actually helping you become a better version of yourself. I think most of us can agree that a better outcome for our life is to be a better person than we are right now. That's always the goal, is to get a little bit better over time. But if our spouse has an expectation of mediocrity for us, I think that actually points more to a lack of love than any sincere love. Of course, your spouse needs to accept you and understand that you have limitations just like they have limitations, but that's very different than accepting that you're never going to try to be a better version of yourself. Additionally, if you truly love your spouse, you're going to want what's best for him or her, and that's going to look like you giving your spouse a better version of yourself. So the love goes both ways, which means the high standards have to go both ways. Okay, number 6, most battles aren't worth having. So this is a really big one. It's also a really tough one. I see a lot of the times couples really struggle to figure out what issues they should bring up and which ones they should let go. And I think this really stems from this sense of concern that if we let go of some of the things our partner does, that is going to be giving them the upper hand. So if we say, my husband didn't do what I asked him to do, but I'm just going to let that go. I'm going to assume it was an accident, or I'm going to assume he just forgot, or my wife was short-tempered with me, but I'm going to let it go. Instead of bringing it up, I'm going to assume she just had a tough day. And when we assume goodness in our spouse, oftentimes that actually brings out more good in them because they feed off of your forgiveness and they'll return that forgiveness right back to you. It creates a much more positive environment where you both can be better versions of yourself. But in the moment, it can still feel like relinquishing control or giving up your ability to hold someone accountable to mistreating you. So if you're having this issue of feeling like you're giving up control, if you are quicker to forgive or quicker even to forget about the little things, try to think about this. By being more forgiving, by letting go of some of these little things, one of two things is going to happen. If your spouse is malicious and is trying to hurt you, then you are going to be relinquishing control to someone who is going to abuse it. That seems unlikely given that your judgment of character is probably a lot better than that. The fact that you devoted your life to this person probably means that your husband or your wife is just flawed and a human being like the rest of us, but isn't evil. The alternative option is that you're more forgiving, you forget about the little things, and you don't bring up as much conflict so that you guys can have some more peace and harmony in the relationship. And then the relationship actually gets better. And you'll notice over time, as you try to be more forgiving, your relationship is going to go down one of these two paths. You're going to notice, is your spouse starting to take advantage of you? Or is that extra forgiveness actually making the relationship much more peaceful and loving? As a side note here, if you're high in neuroticism, it's going to be more difficult for you to let go of more of these small issues because you just naturally detect more potential issues in a relationship or just in life in general. And so if you know you're higher in neuroticism, if you're more prone to depression or anxiety, or you're more sensitive to stress, or you just have more negative emotion in your day-to-day life, try to be gentle and patient with yourself in this process if you want to become quicker to forgive, because you do have a steeper mountain to climb to get there, but it doesn't make it any less important to try or any more meaningful to make that change in your marriage. Okay, number 7. If you start to feel heated in a fight, the only good choice is to walk away. So everyone has had that experience where they're fighting with their spouse and things are starting to get really heated. Maybe you guys are calling each other names or whatever it is, but you can feel your emotions start to rise and your heartbeat quickens and you start to get a little bit sweaty, a little bit anxious, and even feel fidgety or like you need to either fight or flee. And that's that fight or flight mode. It's essentially our body's way of telling us that there is something threatening in our environment that we either need to respond to protect ourselves by either fighting or running away. So when our body enters into this process, our prefrontal cortex, or the front part of your brain, actually mostly turns off, or at least significantly decreases in brain activity, meaning that rational part of our brain that's responsible for rational decision making and logical thought processes, it's not working. And the amygdala, or the emotional center of the brain that is responsible for our more impulsive or instinctual responses to situations, that is in high gear. And so when you are in this fight or flight mode, it no longer makes sense to continue the conversation because you physically cannot think rationally, you can't make good decisions, and oftentimes you're going to say something that you regret just because the emotional part of your brain is now in control. So the only appropriate response when you get into this situation is to tell your spouse, look, I'm feeling flooded, I'm feeling emotional, I don't think we should keep talking about this. Can I just have 20 minutes to calm down and then we can talk about this later? Or even postpone the conversation to the next day. Whatever it is, however long you need to come down from that emotional state, that is the only next step that you should be taking if you and your spouse both care about resolving the conflict in an effective way, rather than it spiraling out of control into a huge fight that you both regret later. Eventually, if you and your spouse are keeping track of these arguments where one or both of you enter fight or flight mode, you can start to identify triggers that will send you over the edge. These triggers may be things like being called a name, or when your spouse talks condescendingly, or if your spouse doesn't make eye contact with you. Whatever it is, together you guys can write down a list of the things that really just tick you off, for lack of a better term, in a relationship, in a conversation that then makes it impossible for you guys to resolve the conflict effectively. And then together you can commit to avoiding all of those triggers for both of you. And that's really going to improve your communication with each other. And number 8, your definition of marriage will set you up for success or failure in the long run. So what I mean by this is that whenever people get married, oftentimes they're thinking about the commitment they make on their wedding day, why they're choosing that person in that moment. Oftentimes it's really difficult for us to project out into the future 20, 30, 40 years or more and answer the question of, okay, if you know why you're getting married, do you also know why you would choose to stay married? And that's really important. So our definition of marriage doesn't just involve why we chose to get married, but why we would stay together, particularly when we get to a point where it may be a lot easier to walk away from the marriage, to separate or get divorced, than it would be to stay. And I personally believe that this happens for every couple. A lot of couples choose in that moment when it's easier to walk away, they choose to leave because their definition of marriage involves why they wanted to be together in the first place. It doesn't necessarily involve, as much as it needs to, the idea of why they would choose to stay with someone, even in a moment where it's incredibly difficult to do so. Life is really hard. Marriage is really hard. People get sick. People lose their jobs. People get into accidents. People get depressed. Whatever it is, life circumstances happen, and they are going to put a significant strain on your relationship that will test your definition of your marital commitment. Is it that I got married because I want to be happy, and as soon as I'm not happy in the moment, then I don't think the marriage is serving me anymore? Or is it that I got married because I wanted to commit my entire life to someone, knowing that we were going to have ups and downs, but no matter those ups and downs, as long as we're both in it, I'm going to keep choosing that relationship over and over again, even on that day when it would be easier to choose something else. One of my favorite quotes that I think about a lot when I'm thinking about the topic of what marriage means to you, it goes something like this: Commitment is when you do what you promised you would, even after the feeling you had when you made that promise is gone. In other words, the real commitment to a marriage is not treating your spouse well when you still have all those feelings of excitement and thrill from the wedding day. Choosing to treat your spouse well, put your spouse first, serve the marriage to the best of your ability on your worst days or the days that you wish you could do anything else. That is what real commitment looks like. And the research evidence is really clear here as well. When people believe that a marital commitment is something you don't break, even under really difficult circumstances, with obvious exceptions, those are the couples that stay together. Okay, guys, thanks so much for tuning in to this second part of my insights as a marriage therapist. I really believe that each of these 8 points are things that you and your spouse can start implementing in your relationship today, because the real improvements that you'll make with your spouse oftentimes are not even in the therapist's office. They are together at home. What you're doing every single day to make the marriage work or not, that is what's going to make all of the difference. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for all things related to building a lifelong marriage. I'm Cameron, and this is Modern Marriage.